taking you out of leg lift here, you can see you sit down, you lean back, not a lot of forward momentum. That shin is staying very vertical. I do like how you're staying closed, but the problem is as you start to move forward, we see all this torquing moving around at the hip here. A lot going on. So we got to go into your mobility. So if we look at your mobility here, you can see hip mobility, rotation, femur rotation, hip internal rotation is only 10 degrees. That needs to be 45. So what's going to happen is you're going to open your front foot. The pelvis is going to want to open, but your femur is going to have to internally rotate for it to really allow the pelvis to drive open. So when you go to open, here comes the back leg turning down. If your shin was more here when you went to open, you could actually drive and extend. So we're getting more rotation because of that. So you can see when you get to here, if I go to the front of your pelvis, that's probably 10 degrees of internal rotation. So about 10 degrees. If I go even farther and I go to the front of the pelvis, you're still in that 10 degrees. It doesn't look like at any point I put you where we're looking at the pelvis, your foot is turned out much more than that 10, maybe 15 degrees to the most. So what's happening is as this femur turns down, it's struggling to rotate enough to push your hip open. Not only that, the point where you land or you're about to land, this is where you would drive, but you only had on hip extension, you only had 10 degrees of hip extension on your left, 5 on your right. So what's happening is now you can't even extend and push that femur forward. So your pelvis really isn't doing much. Your pelvis is pretty much just, it's getting pulled up because of more than likely hip flexion, what we're gonna look at. And then it's slightly rotating into landing because the femur here can't swivel to move it. It can't drive or extend to move it. So the pelvis really isn't doing much. So when we look at kinematic sequence here, we're seeing, if this is the red, just like on the avatar here, this is the red hip speeds and the green trunk speeds. Look at this, your pelvis is rotating. Almost the peak of the pelvis is matching the peak of the trunk. So obviously the pelvis, this is just probably, it is a really low amount of pelvis speeds and there's no push to the trunk. So what's happening is, even if this was good pelvis speeds, for some reason the energy is not getting to the trunk, because we should see the trunk peaking up here. We should see the green peaking. I rarely see the trunk flatten out at the top because it's like the whip, the energy grows as we go up. Normally it's a hard peak, so it's flattening out. That means more than likely this mobility challenges in the hip and what you're doing with the trunk are preventing the energy to really move up. So you're just a lot of upper body as you hit front foot. So you're throwing in the 90s just by landing and using your upper body. So, and let's look at the flexion. The hip flexion on your left leg was 10 degrees. So what happens is when your trunk comes around and it's pretty much, the trunk starts to catch up with the hip, you can't actually go forward. You couldn't bring your trunk forward because you only have 40 or 45 degrees of hip flexion on your left. Sorry if I said that wrong. 45 degrees of flexion. That's more than likely at the 45 degree mark. So you can't actually push your trunk forward. That's why you stay flexed and you spin so hard at the end that when you're at release, you're actually almost 90 degrees in rotation pointing towards the first base dugout because you couldn't get your trunk to go forward because of that only 45 degrees of hip flexion. So what's happening is when you hit, there's no flow of energy. There's very little flow of energy up. It's probably because the way you're leaning back and over this hip. This hip's now, as it comes around in rotation, there really isn't much stretch between the hip and shoulder. If we had more stretch here, then that would actually, as the hip went through, it actually would pull the trunk around. So because you're leaning into that and you're putting slack by leaning over that, you're putting slack in between the hip and shoulder. When the hip goes to rotate, it doesn't really drive it around. So what's driving your shoulder is this glove. As we can see, the blue is the glove peak. That's peaking above the trunk. So the glove is actually pulling you in rotation harder than your trunk. Okay, so that's really what the trunk rotator is the glove. And then here you come around. That's why you like to lean back and on this side of your body, so you can throw your trunk forward and to the opposite way. So the trunk usually is going to counter rotate in the direction it's going to go. So you're counter rotating back and this way, so it's going to counter and pull in the opposite direction, which is where it goes here to release. Okay, so your trunk's going over here to over there, right? And that's because the glove is the driver. Where's the glove pulling it? Across and down, and then that's where the trunk is going. We got to get to a point where we don't have slack between the hip and shoulder. Our trunk is contralateral over here and only slightly back, and then countered in more trunk rotation. And you have the trunk rotation to do that. You had 75 degrees of trunk rotation, so you have the trunk rotation to do that. So we want to feel the tension between the hip and shoulder, and then we need to work on the hip mobility so we can actually drive the hips through to then carry the trunk through. So that's why you're such a rotator at the end, is because your hips don't rotate, which allow you to really power more of the lower half. So you're using your glove as and you're counting, you're rotating your trunk away from your glove, so your glove can then pull across and down, and which is creating most of your power. It's also too why your spin efficiency was poor. You had good spin, poor spin efficiency, because when you're pulling across the ball like that, look where your forearm's going. It's going around. Actually, it loses the speed here, but what it's doing, it's whipping or flying out around the ball, and then you're going to stay more to the side of the ball. If your trunk wasn't spinning so hard to the left, if it was staying more contralateral and driving forward, and your elbow was staying back, and that's a lot harder on your elbow because your elbow's getting ahead, then the arm would want to come over, or the forearm would come up and over. You'd get more pronated, and studies show more pronation speeds improves vertical brake. So you'd get less rifle spin, which kills spin efficiency. You'd get more of that total spin would increase vertical brake, and you'd go 18, 19, 20. Okay. So I mean, the challenge for you is working on, you had your hip abduction wasn't too bad, but you have no internal rotation of the hip. So that means that pelvis or that femur can't rotate to allow the pelvis to come around. You had barely any hip extension, so now you can't extend or triple extend to push the hip through. And then you had very little hip flexion to allow the trunk to go forward. If we can open all that up, then you're going to start powering the lower half. Then we can get better posture in the trunk, and then you're going to see all of that energy push through. You're going to see the green spiking way up here, and you're going to see more velocity, better spin at the end.